Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call to order the May 3rd Town Council meeting. Krista, are we in compliance with the Freedom of Information Act?
Yes, sir, we are.
Could you please make the roll call, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Harkins?
Here.
Mr. Ames?
Here.
Mrs. Becker? Here. Mr. Lennox?
Here.
Mr. Stanford?
Here.
Mayor McCann?
Here.
All present, sir.
Would you please join in the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Thank you. Remain standing, please. The invocation today will be a newcomer to our island, and we welcome you. Pastor Nathan Futrell, please. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you for the people that are gathered here today that care so much, and for those that you have ordained to lead this beautiful city. In our rapidly changing world full of uncertainty, I pray that they receive divine wisdom to lead us into a future of continued prosperity and stability for the good of all people. As decisions are made, may they sleep well knowing that you are at work in all things. Bless their relationships with one another, with businesses and leaders in our community, and cover their families with your love and protection. May all this be for your glory and our good. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Pastor. Okay, approval of the agenda.
Move adoption is written.
Second.
All in favor, please raise their right hand. Thank you very much. Any approval of the minutes?
Move for approval.
Second.
Any changes or additions? All in favor, please raise their right hand. Thank you. Report of the town manager.
Yes, sir. Good evening, everybody. Mayor, council, members of the public. Just a few things to quiet your phone while you're in the audience. Just kidding, Chet. Oh, just kidding. We recently went through a credit analysis with Moody's investors, and based upon the review of their financial results, practices, and the strength of the economy, Moody's has reaffirmed our AAA bond rating status. So if we think back to the beginning of the pandemic, Moody's put all coastal communities on credit watch. And that was an interesting time, and put every coastal community on a negative outlook because of the potential impact on tourist-focused communities. And as a result of the recent review, Moody's has removed that outlook from for our special revenue, hospitality, and beach bonds. And they were impressed with how we withstood the temporary turbulence on the coronavirus pandemic. So congratulations to the council, a big thank you and congrats to our finance director, and really to our community that continued to stay strong through and as we continue to move through the pandemic. Moving along, turtle nesting season has officially started and will continue through October. I know there was a big event the other day and reached out to Amber. I know we had some staff members there, but they recently held an official kickoff event where they dedicated the first nest in honor of Scott Liggett. So I know a very special and moving moment. I know Scott's family was there, and thank you to Sea Turtle Patrol for doing that on behalf of the community. Fire Rescue recently worked with Eagle Scout candidate Peter Roshu to complete his Eagle Scout Community Service project. He installed flag drop boxes for older and tattered American flags that need to be retired correctly. And they're located at 3 locations: Fire Rescue Headquarters at 40 Summit Drive, behind Fire Station 1 off Executive Park Drive, and Fire Station number 5 at 20 Whooping Crane Way. So thank you to the Eagle Scouts and Peter and to Fire Rescue for helping that happen. That concludes my report.
Thank you. Under the general reports here, though, the Interfaith Community in Action and the Hilton Head Island Music and Arts Coalition will be having a benefit in support of the efforts for the Ukraine. Hilton Head for Ukraine will take place on Sunday, May 22nd, from 12 to 6 o'clock at the Lowcountry Celebration Park. There will be food trucks, arts, craft, live classical, chorus, and dance performances. For more information on how you can donate to the cause, please contact hh4ukraine.com. This is something led by Rabbi Bloom. It's taken on a life of its own. It's it's really a great idea, and there's the Ukrainian flag, so we all know who we're putting for, but I encourage us all to go. Thank you. Okay, general reports by members of council.
I have a general report.
Yes, sir.
Mayor. I attended last week the function at Hilton Head Middle School, which was called Art Meets History in a Gallery. It consisted of a series of beautiful murals that were prepared by volunteer local artists, and then they were supplemented by the artwork of many of the students that were there. Our own Jen McEwen led this project in partnership with others, and I want to salute Jen for the outstanding work. I urge every citizen, when you have the opportunity to go into the middle school, to see this out. It tells the history story of Hilton Head Island. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other general reports?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. There's a right of access issue with the cemetery next to Grandview and Hilton Head Plantation. And the cemetery is a native island cemetery that is connected with the local church in the area. And there seems to be some delay in the town clarifying its position on this matter. So I'm just requesting that we roll up our sleeves and resolve this as soon as possible.
Mark and myself will follow up this week on that.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other general reports? Okay, Lowcountry Area Transportation Study, Glenn?
No report on this evening.
Okay, Council of Governments, Tammy?
So the most interesting thing that I wanted to report is that the Lowcountry employment status provided to us on April 22nd through the Lowcountry Council of Governments indicated that in Beaufort County, we have an unemployment rate of 4%. And, 1 second. And that there were over 4,000 job openings in Beaufort County. Thought that was interesting information, and thought I would share that today. Thank you.
Go local, Tom?
Thank you, John. Soloco met on Tuesday, April 26th, and had an update on the Regional Housing Trust Fund, led by Eric Greenway. Jennifer Ray is the town's representative in that effort. Then the town manager of Yemassee presented 2022 goals. Likewise, each administrator for Jasper and Beaufort County updated the board on 2022 goals for each county.
Thank you, Tom. David, the Airport Advisory Board?
I do have a report. The airport terminal project will be advertised for bids this weekend. There's no date set for start of construction and therefore no completion date, but at this point it's moving forward. And then secondly, the expansion of the apron, which accommodates the planes when they're on the ground, is almost complete. It'll be lined this weekend and used very shortly. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Community Service, Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The committee will be meeting next week to review all existing applications for possible openings with our commissions and in groups. So more on that later.
Thank you. Public Planning Committee, David?
Thank you, Mayor. The Public Planning Committee met on April 28th and approved forwarding the e-bikes ordinance onto council. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Finance Committee, Mr. Lennox?
Yes, John, the next meeting of the F&A Committee is 2 weeks from today at 10 o'clock, April 17th, in council chambers.
Thank you. Appearance by citizens, Krista?
Yes, sir. We have 2 citizens that have signed up today to address council. The first is Judith Hillis. Yes, ma'am. Please step to the podium.
Could we have your name and address, please?
My name is Judith Hillis, and I live at Mariners Cove Club, number 104. And as you might guess from my address, I'm here to talk about the bridge. Am I facing the right way?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Needless to say, I was shocked about a week and a half ago to see in the packet that 2 bridges were under consideration instead of the one. Through the years, I've attended at least 3 meetings about the bridge with the South Carolina Department of Transportation, and one meeting was especially for Mariners Cove residents, and at no time did they discuss, the option that was in the paper. And the illustration was shocking because that little white square under the new bridge is my house. And I've lived there for 32 years, lived on the island since 1970 when they had a swing bridge, so I've seen a lot of change. But anyway, I've been there for 32 years, and I would say at least 8 other women, single older women, live out there out of the 40 units, and many of them have lived there longer than I have. In fact, we have one that is an original owner since 1973. And we live out there because it's quiet and it's safe. It's a good place for older women. You don't have to worry about your safety. I lost my husband in January. We were married 52 years. So this house represents a lot of memories. It represents my stability, my safety, my financial situation, everything. I just honestly wonder if I were forced out of my house, what I would do, where I would move in the current Hilton Head situation. I'd probably have to leave the island. I don't know that the powers that be could reimburse me for having a waterfront property, which I do now on the intercoastal. Anyway, I just want you all to think about when you look at those little white squares on that illustration, those are real people in real homes with real lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Krista?
Yes, sir. The last citizen signed up is Richard Ross. Richard Ross, Mr. Ross?
Richard here?
Not seeing him, sir. That concludes appearance by citizens.
Thank you very much. Item number 11, the consent agenda.
Move for approval.
Second.
Any questions by members of the council? Any questions by members of the audience on these 2 items on the consent agenda? Having none, we'll go back to the council. All in favor, please raise the right hand. Thank you very much. New business. Consideration of a resolution authorizing the implementation of a home safety and repair program, including the execution of a memorandum with understanding with the Lowcountry Council of Governments to handle the certificate income certification.
Move for approval.
Second.
Discussion about members of the council. Discussion by members of the community. Okay. Christian, make the roll call, please.
Yes, sir. Mr. Brown?
Support.
Mr. Harkins?
Yes.
Mr. Ames?
Yes.
Mrs. Becker? Yes. Mr. Lennox?
Yes.
Mr. Stanford?
Yes.
Mayor McCann?
Yes.
Motion carries 7-0.
Thank you. Consideration of resolution authorizing the implementation of a sewer connection program, including the execution of a memorandum of understanding with Deep Well, the Lowcountry Council of Governments, and Hilton Head Island Public Service.
Move for approval.
Second.
Discussion by members of the council.
I have something, Mr. Mayor. During committee, we asked staff the question about the abandoned septic systems. I'm just curious to know if we got any word back on that.
Yes, sir, Councilman Brown. Sean Collins, Assistant Town Manager. We did check with DHEC. There are no requirements to fill in or to modify the septic tanks. Property owners can do what they wish with that. A lot of times they're broken up or removed by the owner, but there's no DHEC requirement to do that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any questions by members of the community? Bringing it back to the council. Krista?
Mr. Brown?
Support.
Mr. Harkins?
Yes.
Mr. Ames?
Yes.
Mrs. Becker? Yes. Mr. Lennox?
Yes.
Mr. Stanford?
Yes.
Mayor McCann?
Yes.
Motion carries, sir.
Item number C, consideration of resolution authorizing a town manager to enter into a memorandum of understanding with the South Island Dredging Association to provide funding assistance for the dredging of the Harbortown basin.
Move for approval.
Second?
Discussion by members of the council. David?
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, Tom.
You want me to pull those up? Yeah.
Did you have something you want? Oh,
Josh.
oh, I see.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Mark, members of council. Earlier, there was a question that had come up in regards to this matter. In doing some research on the request that came in and the information that came out of committee that's pending before you this evening, we thought it would be appropriate to take an opportunity and clarify the areas that the town funding would be utilized to perform the dredging activities. And so what you have before you tonight is an aerial that shows both areas that are referenced in the draft resolution that is in your packet materials. The first area is the Harbortown Yacht Basin. The second area is Braddock Cove. And Krista, if you could scroll down, we've taken both of those areas and we've kind of enlarged them. So this is the Harbortown Yacht Basin. You can see the extent of where the dredging would occur within this particular picture. And then if you scroll down one more, this is Braddock Cove with the South Island Marina being about 3/4 of the way down on the left-hand side. So we wanted to take an opportunity and make sure that there was a clear understanding as to where, there's the marina, as to where this dredging activities would take place, and to the extent that there was any concerns, what we would propose is that we would take this information, attach it as an exhibit to the resolution, and that way there's a clear understanding of where the town's funding would be utilized to perform the dredging activities.
Tom, you got a question?
No, I would add to this, the Finance and Administrative Committee reviewed this request and proposed resolution in detail 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
And recommended to council that this come forward.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ames?
Yeah, Josh, what, the total cost of this is $5 million?
Yes, based upon...
Approximately.
Approximately, yeah. The engineer's estimate, I believe, is $4.6 million, but by the time it's completed, they estimate it's going to be a total project cost of $5 million.
I was confused because in one letter from South Island Dredging, there was a reference to Baynard Creek and 52,000 cubic yards. So is the 194,000 less 52?
That's correct.
Okay.
So the South Island Dredging Association is going to be doing more work than what is beyond what the town's providing funding for. And so that's why we wanted to just identify the areas where we anticipate the town funds being used.
Do you happen to know the proportion or the number of cubic yards coming out of Harbortown as opposed to Braddock Cove?
I do not. I don't know if we have a representative from South Island. I believe we do. I will defer to him, and he may be able to answer your technical questions. Sir?
I'm Jack Brinkley. I'm the president of South Island Dredging. Right now, the estimate for Harbortown is just about 40,000 cubic yards. The Heron Point project is still under study, and they have issues that they have to resolve themselves before they can participate in this dredge. But the bulk of the dredging is from Harbortown, but also from Braddock Creek. Braddock Creek is a long creek that you have to open up to get to the primary point of the South Beach Marina.
Where is Heron Point?
Well, Heron Point is the creek that's immediately south of the Harbortown Marina.
Oh, okay, all right. That answers.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And Mr. Ames, one more thing that I would add that I think is important for this discussion is what is being proposed is that this funding would be provided on a reimbursement basis, which means invoices showing where the work had been performed would then be used as backup to provide those payments.
Thank you, Josh. I have some comments I would like to make, and I'm not sure that, thank you, Josh.
Sure.
And I make these comments not so much directed at this particular project, but to make a point generally. First of all, I acknowledge that this is our vote today is basically consistent with something that was put in place several years ago, and I'm not trying to change that. My comments address the funding of facilities behind private gates and the need for the public to understand under what circumstances they are justified. The $600,000 of hospitality tax attached to this proposal could be invested in higher priority areas if the council deemed it appropriate. In the strategic plan, there's references to programming, maintenance, and enhancement of public realm, and so you instantaneously have this conflict between investing behind the gates and investing in the public realm. And at this time, I don't think we have clearly expressed or spoken to how we qualify those investments behind the gates. I understand the need and benefit for this. I happened to live in Braddock Cove a number of years ago and was very aware of the silting in and the need for periodic dredging. But again, the question becomes, at what point does something behind the gate rise to the level of a clear public benefit? Both in the case of Harbor Town and South Beach, it's obvious that Harbor Town rises to a very different level of public than South Beach Marina and Braddock Cove. In the statement of the letter, it says both are used by the public for docking, sightseeing, navigation, and provide access to public facilities and other tourism-related activities. I would challenge whether or not Gull Point does, or whether the capability further down in Braddock Cove does. So my question is access truly public if a gate pass is required? And hypothetically, or should there be a reimbursement for commercial establishments or from commercial establishments to have free access? So I'm just probing here and challenging our way we assess whether or not we ought to be putting public dollars behind gates. From a transparency standpoint, the total budget is $5 million. Approximately 142 of that is in Harbor Town, which is the highest priority, and 100,000 is going down into Braddock Cove, which is a lower priority from a town standpoint, and a substantial amount of that is not servicing the commercial establishments that are theoretically the justification. So I raise these questions not to challenge this particular proposal, but for council to consider that it probably would behoove us to be more transparent and clearer in why and how we can invest in behind the gates. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Comments from members of the community? Mr. Brown, member of the community, sir.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ames provoked some thoughts for me along the way there. I can remember when I first joined council, we were having a strategic workshop, and we talked about rising tides floating all boats. And in this case, we need to do a little dredging to get the boats to float with the tide rising, right?
Good.
But, you know, transparency is one word that did come to mind here. And even as you read our agenda item here, It reads providing funding assistance for dredging of Harbortown Yacht Basin, but yet we have the South Beach area included in this proposal. And I know that Harbortown is the highlight and brings the most attention, but that transparency is important to our community as a whole. And I will be supporting this today because a couple of reasons. Number one, Harbortown, although it's not totally publicly known, but from a water access point, it is public. You can dock there on a daily basis for free. They'll even clean out your waste for you. I didn't learn that until I took the tour of the quarterdeck. But I think that's important for our community to know that both of those areas are accessible to the public. And the other reason is there's a lot of funds that are generated because of what happens in Harbortown and South Beach. And I'm just looking for, as I mentioned earlier, all boats to float because of that. So as we pay attention to this, we also need to pay attention to other parts of the island that are in need of funding, particularly when it comes to stormwater as such. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the time.
Thank you. Any more comments by the council? Comments by members of the community? Having seen none, Kristen, make the roll call, please.
Mr. Brown?
Support.
Mr. Harkins?
Yes.
Mr. Ames?
Yes.
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mr. Lennox?
Yes.
Mr. Stanford?
Yes.
Mayor McCann?
Yes.
Motion carries, sir.
First reading proposal ordinance 2022-909, amending section 4520 of the municipal code of Town of Hilton Head Island, extending the expiration date of the real estate transfer fee from December 31st, 24 to December 31st, 2044.
So moved.
Second.
Discussion by members of the council.
Yes, John, I'd like to thank the Hilton Head Association of Realtors for diving in on this issue and helping us understand the best way to structure this extension. They have supported this, and I think we wouldn't be where we are without their assistance.
Thank you. Mr. Brown?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this one. There's a couple of words in the first whereas that I'm getting excited about. I just wanted to share it publicly. When it talks about, and by the way, those that adopted this way before our time, I'm glad that they had the foresight, okay? But it talks about acquiring lands for public ownership, maintain open space and environmental protection, acquire developed land or develop rights, okay? I know we've had some discussion in the past around developmental rights and moving them from one area to another. As you start to read through this, you get a better understanding that that is possible, okay? That there's an opportunity for us to do that. So I'm really excited about that. And then it goes on further to say that we should be doing this in accordance with the town's current comprehensive plan, not the comprehensive plan from then, but the one that we have in front of us now, our plan. So again, I'm really excited about the direction here. I'm sure Mr. Orlando has more to come as far as discussion around this. So I'm ready to move forward and support this one.
Mr. Stanford.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This source of funding has generated millions and millions of dollars, which the town has been able to reinvest in making our community better. A lot of it has been spent making Highway 278 as green as we possibly can make it. That is really a good thing. So this has been a vital economic resource where people that are buying homes pay a small tax that goes into a fund, which in turn is an investment in this community. It was an outstanding idea. We are unique in the state in having this, and so I certainly support extending it. Thank you.
Jamie? Okay. Members of the community, any comments? Bringing it back to the council. Krista, make the roll call, please.
Mr. Brown?
Support.
Mr. Harkins?
Yes.
Mr. Ames?
Yes.
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mr. Lennox?
Yes.
Mr. Stanford?
Yes.
Mayor McCann?
Yes.
Motion carries, sir.
Thank you. First reading proposal ordinance 20-22-10, amending section 10.9.10 of the municipal code of the town of Hilton Head Island regarding the billing for ambulance services.
So moved.
Second.
Discussion by members of the council. Comments from members of the community. Tricia, could you call the roll call, please?
Mr. Brown?
Support.
Mr. Harkins?
Yes.
Mr. Ames?
Yes.
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mr. Lennox?
Yes.
Mr. Stanford?
Yes.
Mayor McCann?
Yes.
Motion carries, sir.
Okay. We're ready now. First reading of ordinance 20-2206, amending Title 10 of the Municipal Code of the Town of Hilton Head Island by adding Chapter 2 entitled Short-Term Rentals.
Move for approval.
Second.
Thank you. Ann's going to have a presentation. Thank you, Ann.
Good afternoon, councilors. For the record, Ann Siren, Interim Community Planning Manager. And we'll try to move through this as quickly as I can while giving you the information that I think you need. Okay. We'll start with the committee recommendation, review the project purpose statement, give you a brief summary of our initiative to date, review short-term rental trends, their distribution, and complaints about short-term rentals. We'll discuss inspections, which was a question that came up during the committee meeting. We'll discuss the proposed ordinance with the revisions from the committee, the proposed permit fee in comparison with other communities' fees, the operational program to make the short-term rental program operate, and next steps, and then summarize again with the committee's recommendation. On March 24th, the Public Planning Committee recommended adoption of the proposed short-term rental ordinance to Town Council, subject to such revisions as may be agreed upon by Town Council at the time of the hearing. And the revisions of the ordinance, as you noted in your packet, were noted on the proposed ordinance, double underlined and struck through, and we'll cover those as we review the ordinance. Starting with the project purpose statement, again, as a resort area, Hilton Head has numerous short-term rental units. And I want to state just at the outset how important short-term rentals are to our economy. Everyone on staff and all the stakeholders recognize the importance of short-term rentals. So I want to keep that in mind as we discuss these regulations. But the lack of an ordinance has led to an imbalance between residential and resort districts and the elimination of some long-term single-family neighborhoods. So what we're proposing is to craft a short-term rental ordinance to develop a fair, predictable, and balanced approach to manage these impacts on our neighborhoods, the economy, housing stock, public facilities, and the quality of life of residents and the experience of our visitors. Now, the proposed ordinance is a step towards managing the impacts of short-term rental impacts on neighborhoods and the quality of life of residents and the experience of visitors. Aside from implementing the ordinance and the operational program that I'll discuss later, in March, the Public Planning Committee approved a preliminary framework to examine other issues related to short-term rentals, and I'll discuss that later in the presentation. So this is one step. A brief summary of the initiative to date. This began in spring of 2021. In response to increasing complaints and concerns about short-term rentals, Town Council directed staff to develop an ordinance as discussed in the project purpose statement. Staff presented research on other communities' ordinances to the Public Planning Committee and received feedback. In the summer, we executed a contract with a code writing consultant and developed a project framework. Staff and the consultant presented that framework to the Public Planning Committee in the fall. Throughout the fall and winter, we executed the project framework, including research, gathering data, and executing an extensive community engagement plan. So we held 13 stakeholder meetings, 3 public open houses, we had a survey with a huge number of responses, we had local media articles and interviews to make sure that we were gathering as much input as possible moving through this process. And based on our findings and learnings to date, in January, we presented an ordinance to address the organization, character, expectations, and operations of short-term rentals, which is the ordinance that you'll be reviewing. The policy framework for the ordinance included standards for property management, safety, noise, trash, and parking. We presented a proposed, the actual draft ordinance with the elements of that framework to the committee in March. We also presented a list of issues for future review to the committee and received feedback. We brought that revised ordinance back to the committee in March, and we'll be reviewing the revisions based on the comments we received to that meeting today. Okay. Taking a look at short-term rental trends. So Hilton Head Island obviously has had short-term rentals for decades, but recently the number of units has increased rapidly. We estimate about a 31% increase in short-term rental listings between July 2019 and January 2022. We've actually just closed our bids for short-term rental monitoring software, and I'll discuss that as we move through the presentation. That's going to provide us more detailed data and trends over time by neighborhood. So we estimated the number of short-term rental listings by averaging the data from 3 short-term rental monitoring services. We also have data on short-term rentals from business license applications and from AirDNA, which is a short-term rental company that's primarily used for marketing purposes, but does give an overall understanding for us of short-term rentals. Unlike other businesses that are easier to identify using ads with addresses and phone numbers, short-term rentals are more difficult to monitor. There are several factors impacting that, including the anonymity of online host sites like Airbnb, and the fact that some short-term rentals are only offered for rent during a few weeks or months during the year. Another important note is that until January of this year, owners who only had 1 short-term rental were not required to have a business license. So using the data we have, we estimate that approximately 10,000 short-term rentals are listed for rent at some point during the calendar year. It's about 1/3 of the residential units that are on the island. As I mentioned, we issued a request for proposals for short-term rental monitoring and compliance software, and we're reviewing those bids now. The software is extremely useful in ensuring all short-term rentals are licensed and registered and that they're remitting taxes. What they do is regularly scrape the data from short-term rental listing sites, and it geolocates those listings. So instead of giving you a picture in a general neighborhood, we can actually find the specific address. It also uses human verification to ensure the listings are genuine and that they're not duplicated. That data will be cross-referenced with the town's business license regulations to assure each listing is a business license, and we'll be able to auto-generate letters to notify owners without business licenses that they need to come into compliance. The contract will include short-term rental monitoring compliance software, including a permit portal, a complaint hotline and portal, and I'll discuss those in a minute. We'll also be able to import that data into our GIS system to make maps showing us the exact locations of short-term rentals. So a lot of information there about numbers. Let's go into locations. So as the disclaimer states, this map is generally representative of the distribution of short-term rentals on the island. So each dot represents a short-term rental listing from AirDNA. So they're not exactly because they haven't been geocoded and verified by a human, but this gives you an idea of where they're located. Notably, in the larger gated communities, they're allowed in Sea Pines, Palmetto Dunes, and Shipyard, and they're not prohibited or restricted in the other large gated communities. So you can see it covers almost all of North and South Forest Beach and Folly Field and Holiday Homes. Okay. So regarding complaints, some neighborhoods, both in gated communities and non-gated communities, have reported a sharp increase in the number of short-term rentals in recent years. If you listen to the stakeholder meetings and open houses, and if you view the comments in the survey and the comments submitted individually, you'll have seen the complaints from residents about how their formerly quiet neighborhoods have been transformed by the presence of short-term rentals. Again, while many short-term rentals are well managed, some are a consistent or even inconsistent nuisance, depending on how popular the property is and how well managed it is. And this greatly impacts those residents' quality of life. We have data from the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office, which confirms the rise in nuisance issues like parking, noise, and general disturbance follow the rise in seasonal visitors, as you'd imagine. Short-term rentals, like hotels, are more or less occupied based on the season. Right now, AirDNA estimates an occupancy rate of 81%. It's closer to 60% in the winter. During some holidays, it's 100%. Sea Pines provided data showing a rise in both short-term rental passes and calls for service, which I'll review in a minute. The proposed ordinance would facilitate the creation of a short-term rental program that would allocate additional resources to enforcement and provide additional enforcement options for non-compliant properties. Property owners associations have some options to respond to problematic short-term rentals, but they don't have the options that the town has as a municipality. The town has the ability to issue citations or, in an extreme case, suspend or revoke a short-term rental permit for an individual property or to suspend or revoke a business license. The town's goal is to achieve voluntary compliance for education. The proposed ordinance isn't meant to allow or encourage the town to issue more citations. In fact, it's the opposite. The proposed ordinance is meant to set expectations through permitting for how short-term rentals should be managed. The complaint hotline and portal will allow the town to effectively monitor and track the few short-term rentals that are mismanaged. In the case that a complaint is unresolved, or if there are repeated complaints, the town can review the information gathered by the software to start a conversation with the management company or the owner. Other communities have reported that, for the most part, they don't issue citations because the owner and property management companies work with their code enforcement officers to find solutions to repeated complaints. So let's take a look at the short-term, or the data from Sea-Pines. So this was provided by Sea-Pines CSA at our request and with their permission. You can see the calls for service, which is the blue line, rises right along with the number for short-term rental passes, which is the gray line, issued in recent years. The 40% increase in the number of short-term rental passes between 2019 and 2021 tracks with the town's trend. It's a little bit higher, but we saw the same sharp increase from 2019 to 2021. With the complaint hotline and portal, which I mentioned earlier, the purpose of those services is to decrease calls for service and other third-party intervention, like town code enforcement services, by requiring an owner or their manager to be the first point of contact for complaints about short-term rentals. The hotline, which is staffed 24 hours a day, and the complaint portal both serve the same purpose. They take in and record complaints, verify they're regarding a short-term rental, contact the owner or their agent to notify them of the complaint, and follow up the complainant to ensure the issue was resolved. If the issue is resolved, the town doesn't need to intervene. But if there are ongoing problems or problems that aren't being resolved, the town has the benefit of detailed records of the previous complaints, which can include evidence such as photos and audio and video files. With this number for calls for service, you can see how a complaint portal and hotline could be helpful for both neighbors and private communities by reducing the number of times they need to intervene with a complaint. In most cases, the issue is resolved with a quick phone call or text from the owner or manager to the guest. So I'll discuss enforcement more when we review the ordinance. Okay. Go over inspections. I'll try to be as brief as I can. I apologize for taking up too much of your time. Regarding inspections, staff recommends option A, or option 1, excuse me, which is our original suggestion, which is that owners are responsible for inspecting and verifying that their properties meet safety requirements. Fire rescue and town building inspectors do investigate complaints on a complaint-driven basis about short-term rentals and all of their properties. We'll continue to do that. We're recommending that a new inspector be hired to investigate complaints and perform spot inspections on short-term rentals to ensure safety requirements are met. So the options are outlined in the memo by Chief Tadlock in your materials. I'd be happy to answer any questions or cover that further. But we do have option 2 and option 3 outlined. So again, we recommend option 1, and that we reevaluate the feasibility of requiring annual inspections as we have more information about short-term rentals. Moving on to the proposed ordinance. As a note, again, the changes that were made since the March 24th Public Planning Committee are indicated with a strike-through or a double underline. And Krista, could you open the ordinance, please? Sure. Thank you very much. Okay, before we begin, I just want to note that concerns that were previously raised about conflicts between the ordinance and state laws, specifically renters' rights, have been, the town attorney has assured that there is no conflict between the ordinance and any kind of state laws. We did, you can see in the whereas section here, added 2 general whereas statements. And scrolling down, do I have the ability to scroll on this, Krista?
Good. I'm happy to do it.
Is that me scrolling? No? All right. We did add a purpose and intent statement It's important to note that the ordinance is not intended to regulate hotels, motels, hospitals, or interval occupancy uses, which are timeshares. So this ordinance would not apply to timeshares. It's also important to note that the ordinance is not intended to regulate short-term lease agreements that may arise out of real estate transactions. So that was a question that came up among the realtors. If I sell my house and the new owner leases it back to me for 2 weeks, do I fall under this ordinance? No, you don't. The ordinance was revised to make the owner definition a little more thorough. And just to note that the definition of short-term lease is less than 30 days. Regarding short-term rental agents, one of the questions was who can act as my agent? It's anyone who agrees to act as your agent. Now, there's no licensing requirement. It can be a neighbor or a trusted relative, or it can be a company, whoever you prefer. Just a note that the short-term rental permit is an annual permit. And moving on to the next section regarding short-term rental permits. This is an annual permit. As I mentioned earlier, the town is reviewing responses to our request for proposals for monitoring and compliance software. We hope to install, test, and open to the public this fall the permitting portal so that folks will have plenty of time to be able to apply for their short-term rental permits before January 1st, 2023, when enforcement of the ordinance begins, and I'll touch on that later. Just as a note, the short-term rental permit is different from a business license. You would need to obtain both a business license and a short-term rental permit, and I'll go into the differences and the benefits about that later. The application fee is set each year by town council, just as a note. We did not include that in the ordinance so that we would have flexibility to respond to town council if they want to move that up or down. And the application requirement for a site plan for a single-family detached residence was added to make enforcement easier. This doesn't need to be a surveyed site plan as long as it is roughly to scale. It can be hand-drawn, but primarily it's going to show us where the parking is located and where the trash enclosure is located on a site for a single-family residence. Moving on, we added a section stating that the short-term rental permit cannot be issued for a property where there are outstanding citations, outstanding meaning non-adjudicated citations. The next section was added to specify every person, business entity, scroll up just a little bit, thank you, who submits an application. This is just to clarify, if an owner wants to have their property management company submit the entire application for them and they just sign consenting, they can do that. They can also submit the application themselves. Scrolling down to section 5, 10-250. I just want to clarify before I dive into the specific regulations how owners or agents will verify that they meet the requirements. There will be an application form stating my property meets these requirements. You'll check a box, or in the occasion where you'll need to submit additional information like a site plan, you'll attach that site plan to the application form. So that's how you'll apply for a short-term rental permit, but primarily it's going to be a series of check boxes affirming that you meet requirements. So in terms of owner availability, the requirement is that the owner or their agent should be available at all times during the short-term rental and be capable of being physically present at the short-term rental. What that means is that you will be able to, within an hour, take a phone call about a complaint that goes to the owner or to their agent. And I mentioned that we have short-term rental property management companies in the area. I actually just spoke with an entrepreneur in the area who's interested in opening a business just to provide response. That would be their property management business. So there are a lot of options, and the owner doesn't have to hire someone. They can handle this themselves if they'd like. But effectively, the first point of contact should be the phone call. The owner or their agent makes contact with the guest to convey what the issue is, and the guest, most of the time, will take care of the issue. In the rare instance where the issue needs to be resolved in person, the expectation is that the owner or their agent would be able to be at the property within an hour. Regarding building and fire code requirements, such as the smoke detector and carbon monoxide detector and escape routes, the specific requirements for the units will be given with the application materials. And so we didn't want to specify that too specifically in the ordinance, so we wouldn't have to update it when building and fire code regulations change. So we'll provide all that information in the specifications that you have to meet with the application forms. Moving down to parking regulations. Just a little bit further down, I think. In section 4. So we made a note to make sure that all the communications are right, and there we go. We did remove the exemption for specifying the number of parking spaces for properties that are within 24-hour private security communities, such as the larger gated communities. That ensures equitable permitting requirements and enforcement. But the requirements remain the same. You have to specify the maximum number of parking spaces. They need to be 9 by 18 feet. Okay. Moving on to the violation section in section 6. We just added you'll see the double underline, we just added the names of the sections for easier reference. And moving further down to suspension or revocation of business license. That last section, subsection F, we revised to just provide more clarity. More than 2 convictions, not citations, but convictions of violations of the municipal code arising from activities or connected with a short-term rental could make that subject to consideration for suspension of the short-term rental permit. And moving down to the last change at the end is section 9. It's the effective date. We just made a slight modification to this. This says that the ordinance is effective upon its adoption, but the enforcement begins on January 1st. That allows the town to begin issuing short-term rental permits this fall, as we intend to do. Okay. Are there any questions that I can answer about the ordinance?
Yes. What metrics are you going to use to evaluate the efficacy of this?
I think there are a number of metrics that we can use. We'll have a tremendous amount of data. First, we'll understand how many short-term rentals we actually have to a better degree. We have a good idea of what the estimate is. We'll be able to hone in on that. We'll be able to hone in on their location, and we'll be able to look at complaints. So what we want to see is, the purpose of this is to make sure that, one, we have everyone licensed, remitting taxes, and performing to the same safety and standards as everyone else. So if we have some unlicensed short-term rentals, we want to make sure they're licensed, they're operating correctly. The other purpose is to track complaints and resolve complaints. So that's going to be one of the big metrics that we look at. Who's complaining? How are the owners responding to complaints? Are they resolving them? If there are properties that are having continual complaints, that gives us the option to pursue further code enforcement.
Thank you.
Sure.
Tammy?
So in my mind, a lot of this is to help with the residents' concerns that their quality of life has been increasingly interfered with by the rising numbers of short-term rentals, and more importantly, the many hotels with the high occupancies. Explain to me just a little bit more about how the website or the system where you would call in to make a complaint, and then the system would call the owner or the agent to respond within an hour. And if necessary, that someone would be on site after that. How does that work? How do we know whether or not that's been resolved? The owner calls up and says, look, I was out there, I made a phone call, I told them, whatever the issue was to resolve it, and then we're done with it. And then unless another complaint comes in that same evening that triggers the next step, how does that work?
So staff can monitor the short-term rental complaints that come in. I think if an overview of the system is where the complaints come in, each complaint is monitored or recorded. The staff then verifies that it's about a short-term rental. So they check their permit, say, yes, this is a short-term rental property. They reach out to the owner, as you mentioned, or the agent to have them resolve that. Each community can set up the system as they would like. Some communities have a system where the company circles back to the complainant within an hour and say, hey, did you receive a response? Has this issue been resolved? The complainant can say no, in which case that can be flagged in the system and town code enforcement can follow up on those. We can also just look at the data without being notified of it or flagged. We can just review, come in from a weekend, for example, review all of the complaints that came in. There were 3 noise complaints each night at property XYZ. Now they were resolved because they turned the music down, but that's something that we might want to look at and have a conversation with them about.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Alex?
I don't have any questions on the ordinance. Are you going to talk a little bit about next steps, or are we going to move?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm halfway through about.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Proposed permit fee. For clarification, and before we dive into the calculations behind the suggested fee, I just want to clarify the business license issue, and I can speak to this more if there's additional questions. But again, as of January 1st, all short-term rentals on the island, whether it's an owner of a single short-term rental or the owner of multiple, must have a business license. You can have a single business license with multiple short-term rentals attached to it. So that is part of the reason it's a little bit difficult in the business license software to determine the number of short-term rentals. So, and they're also grouped together with long-term rentals. So, but in any case, so like all businesses on the island, short-term rentals are required to have the business license, and the revenue collected from those is directed to the town's general fund. Short-term rentals, usually most communities have a fee that goes along with it for short-term rentals because it requires an amount of regulation that's not applicable to other businesses. And given the scale of the number on our island, it makes some sense that we would have additional resources that are required for that. So we're recommending a $250 annual fee, and the fee is going to cover 3 general categories, which I'll go into more in a second. Software, equipment, personnel, and support services. Again, this is our proposed fee. Town council would approve the fee annually during the budget process. This fee can only be used for purposes related to short-term rentals. It, by state law, cannot be used for anything else. So we tried very hard to estimate what we think is the appropriate fee given the amount of services and software, vehicles, personnel that we would require. So just very briefly, and I can go into this in more depth if you'd like, our largest expense is software. It's a pretty comprehensive system as I described it. We will have additional personnel. Part of, and one of the things I want to note is that their entire salary isn't necessarily covered by the short-term rental permit fees. So if you see the asterisk next to public safety director that says 50% of the position is funded by those fees. For code enforcement, we'll have 4 new personnel in addition to the 2 existing personnel. 60% of those salaries of the 6 employees is covered by permit fees. So just a note, there is a recognition that the code enforcement will be doing short-term rental work and other enforcement work on the island. We'll also have a contract manager and that new inspector that I mentioned. We'll also need IT support, legal support. Some of the fees will go to public safety and beach services, a small amount, and we'll have administrative fees. So we're very confident that we can guarantee at least 7,000 short-term rentals. We think it's a lot closer to 10,000 with the, but we will be certain when we have the software in place with a recommended fee of $250 that gives us a range of $1.75 to $2.5 million a year against our annual expenses of $1.5 to $2.15 million a year. As I said, the fees can only be used for short-term rentals, and that can be adjusted annually. So if we get into the program, if we find we can lower that fee, I would recommend that we lower the fee. We think this is our best estimation based on what other communities are doing, what we think our expenses are going to be. Speaking of other communities, almost all other communities that we surveyed do require a separate business license and do require a short-term rental fee. And if you average that out, it's about $225. Okay.
And I have a question on that.
Yes, sir.
Those fees are on the calendar year, correct?
I apologize.
Calendar year?
Yes, it's an annual fee. Yes, sir.
And you said that we were going to adopt the ordinance and move forward with it. And I thought I heard you say so that people could start processing their permits. What?
The reason that we changed the effective date is so that we can make sure that we can open the permit portal and have people start to apply for their 2023 permits in advance of the start of January 1st.
Without having to write the check.
Right, they wouldn't have to write the check, we can collect the check starting in January.
I just wanted that to be clear.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay. Regarding the operational program, so if the ordinance is approved, we would secure that contract for software and permitting services. We're reviewing those RFPs now. Finalize and publish the application form, the support materials that I mentioned specifying what exactly you need for fire or safety equipment, a good neighbor brochure, and we'll create and test our permitting portal. Again, to begin accepting applications this fall in advance of that January 1st enforcement deadline. We'll recruit, hire, and train new employees, the public safety director, code enforcement officers, contract manager, and inspector. We'll secure the required equipment, including vehicles. We'll create and execute an education and communications plan, which we understand needs to be very robust. We've got a lot of folks who live out of town, and a lot of folks who need help walking through the application process. So this will be an ongoing and robust communications plan to notify everyone and to make sure everyone understands what's expected of them and what the deadlines are. And January 1st, we'll begin enforcement efforts, and including ensuring compliance with the ordinance requirements and spot inspections. Okay. I'll move into next steps. So again, this is phase 1, to establish performance standards for short-term rentals of the short-term rental initiative. This is not the end of the short-term rental initiative. We do have phase 2, which is to investigate additional issues and monitor short-term rental numbers and trends. We may want to consider a short-term rental advisory committee. We do want to examine high occupancy short-term rentals and high floor area ratio single-family structures. We can list those or consider those two separately. We want to consider occupancy limits based on the number of bedrooms and a pilot program to address Saturday check-ins. Generally, the last bullet is to examine the impacts of the increasing number of short-term rentals on the island and the implications of that trend for the future. There's a lot carried in that and a lot implied in that, but the data that we'll gather will give us some guidance on that. Any questions about those next steps?
I would just like to say, no, it's okay. I would just like to say that, as I have before, some of these next steps in my mind really should be things that we are currently working on. It would have, in my mind, been a better way to go to include some of these steps into phase 1. I think that overall the town has a lot to do with its responsibilities for creating a community where the impact on residential neighborhoods and the quality of life of those who not only live in them year-round, part-time, but also our visitors expect here on Hilton Head. And so working together in bringing phase 2 forward quickly, in my mind, is really incredibly important, since in my mind it's long overdue. So in the long run, all of this combined should have the goal and a success rate of ensuring that our residents have someone they can call when they're being disturbed, and that the monitoring system is effective in making sure that those complaints and reports are addressed quickly and the problem resolved, and we can move on. For the majority of the short-term rentals out there, I don't think there's an issue. But for those that there are, it's substantial to the neighbors. And this is what brought us to where we are today. So phase 2 is incredibly important to get started on as soon as possible.
Thank you. Alex?
I'd first like to thank staff, in particular Ms. Iron, for the work that has been done thus far. You've been very attentive, you've listened very well, and you've presented very well. I know it's been somewhat of a long presentation here, but there's a lot of information there, and maybe the first time for some folks in the public. As far as next steps are concerned, I'm trying to anticipate a potential disconnect here, okay? We have not gotten to phase 1 in a vacuum. We've done it very publicly, okay? And with the advisory committee being one of the recommendations for next step, I think that's critical because it continues to engage with those that are affected, either as a short-term rental provider or a resident that is concerned about the nuances, okay? And as we all know, as things start to get down the road, we have less and less participation because of fatigue. So I think the advisory committee is crucial to us moving forward. And it really relates to the ordinance that is before us also, because if we have those that are not following the rules eventually come before us as a body to make a final decision as to if they're going to stay in business or not, I think the advisory committee can help us to make a sound decision, okay? I think that's very important along the way. You'll have experts from both sides giving us sound information. I think the occupancy limits are really important. You know, how many folks are actually within the short-term rental establishment. I think the more people you get in the smaller situation causes more issues. So that piece is critically important. The Saturday check-in piece, I guess that's a little stickler for me because we all know that getting on the Hilton Head on Saturday is such a chore. And if we could jump on that, then maybe that helps with some of our traffic issues that we continue to discuss over and over again. So I think that's a grand opportunity for us. Those are my thoughts as far as next steps are concerned. And again, I applaud Ann and also Councilman Ames and his leadership at the Public Planning Committee. I think we'll get to a good place in phase 2 fairly quickly. So we've got our sleeves rolled up and ready to go. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I have to publicly say that your leadership in this area has really been outstanding because you have been humble in your persistence and you have been dogged in getting the information that the public has requested. So thanks for that. I think this is a good list. My anticipation is that there will be other things added to it. You know, when we talk about impact of short-term rentals, if we have, use the number 7,000, if those are rented 13 weeks of the year, we have one impact. If they're rented 52, we have another. So total number of tourists and impacts is something that we ought to be looking at. And then you hinted at occupancy rates, annual occupancy rates of short-term rentals. Do we have an average at this point or not?
We do not at this point, but
right.
we will anticipate having that.
Okay. I think that as we tease out where the really critical issues are, I think we'll know what this list really ought to be. But I want to say the emphasis in phase 1, the ordinance, has attempted to balance sort of resident interests, visitor interests. We as a community of residents, I think, share some responsibility to be ambassadors of goodwill and hospitality, but we should also be expecting our visitors to come into this community with some sensitivity and respect. And so how we do that is one of our significant challenges. I think that the purpose, in my mind anyway, of the ordinance is to establish a standard of quality, to have clear expectations for owners, for rental agents, and for visitors. And to the degree that we can succeed in articulating those expectations, I think will be a better place to visit and a better place to live. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I have some general comments.
Yes, sir.
Fine, thank you. First of all, I don't like regulation any more than anybody else does. But I sincerely believe that we were forced into this action because of two adverse impacts on our community. The first was adverse impact on what we call island character. We don't want to be a rental paradise. We want us to be a paradise, and we need to have reasonable controls on this. The second has to do with abuses of a few. I know that we have the vast majority of the owners of short-term rentals in this community and the managers who manage properties for others are responsible, are responsive, and try to do the very best job to provide a quality experience to those tenants, at the same time expecting them to respond to us and to have good attitudes. This ordinance has been under consideration for more than 2 years. There have been multiple meetings. There's been a great deal of input received from various components in the community, from the management companies, from individual citizens, from various communities around. Under Ann's excellent leadership, this information has been assimilated, and then a second main thrust had to do with drawing on the experience of other coastal communities dealing with the short-term rental issues. So we have examined, staff primarily has examined, Public Planning Committee has also examined the ordinances of other communities seeking to regulate short-term rentals. And I think what we have here is the best assimilation of those using the best tools based upon the experience of other communities facing similar problems. So I do salute Ann and the staff for an outstanding job being done in the full view of the public from beginning to end. Thank you very much for all of your efforts in that regard. And with regard to next steps, I agree that this is just a start. I am intrigued with the notion of a citizen advisory committee so that we're not having to put more work on the town staff, but rather an advisory committee that could gather data for us over the remainder of the year and into the future so that we can understand more of the details about this problem. I ran for this council on the basis of residents first. So I am looking to the residents of this island and trying to protect their interests, at the same time looking out for the interest of our vital tourism community. So I think this is a proper next step, and I intend to support it. Thank you, Mayor.
You finished, Ann?
Yes, sir. I just
Okay, no,
wanted to
go ahead.
bring
I
up
don't mean to rush you. Is there any more questions by members of the council?
I would just add that, and you've led an effort that I think has been characterized by a high degree of public participation, a high degree from the business leaders in our community that are in this sector, and you've been very transparent in the process, and your competence has helped us a great deal, and you've also drawn from the competence of others in the same field in other communities on the East Coast here. So yes, this is a good start. I don't know where we'll end up here. I would encourage you to agree on some clear metrics going forward so that you can start measuring again how well you're doing, how well we're doing, and moving in that direction that may avoid the need for more onerous activity in this area. If we can prove to ourselves we're doing a good job, maybe we can lessen the requirement for oversight.
Mayor, if I can just take 2 more seconds.
Yes, ma'am.
I rushed into my comments, which I think are important, and I hope that I was glad I was able to share. You know, I've said it before publicly, but I want to hear again, say thank you. I think the amount of respect, the calm nature that you've had throughout all of these meetings has been absolutely remarkably sensitive to the issues and to our residents and our visitors and our businesses. And I appreciate everything you've done to get us there. Thank you. You represent our town well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from the community? I'm shocked. Yes, sir. Please come up here. Please give us your name and address. Thank you, Ann, very much.
I'm from Linden, Michigan. I'm a property owner in Palmetto Dunes. You're looking at somebody who's been sued over audio levels that have come from their property. I own a farm in Michigan. I had a neighbor with bad intentions. Audio levels can be very subjective. This person sued me for the audio levels coming from my farm. I hired a professional sound company to study the levels of sound coming from my farm. And it turned out during the lawsuit that those audio levels were the equivalent of me having a conversation with somebody standing at the property line. So they lost the lawsuit. I didn't get my $150,000 back defending myself, and I'm just concerned that something as subjective as sound could cause somebody to lose their ability to rent their property, given a neighbor who maybe has bad intentions like mine. Are there any audio levels that are associated with these complaints, that they have to be sustained for a certain level of amount of time? I mean, how is that all determined?
Yes, Ann, oh, you're right there. I'm looking for you over there. Me too. Ann's gonna, yes, thank you, sir. Thank you for your question.
Sir, thank you. The town's municipal code includes a chart with decibel levels that are the acceptable levels of noise that's produced. We also have a general statement that you're not supposed to disturb the peace between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. So that leaves some discretion for the town, but also measurement to ensure that we're within those levels.
And that's online on our website?
That's in the municipal code right now, sir.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Next question? Yes, sir.
Thank you, and I apologize for the noise at the beginning. I'm David Berry. I'm a lawyer here on the island and have owned a house down in North Forest Beach since 1990. And I rent it now on the short-term rental market. And I guess the thing that kind of concerns me about this entire discussion is the implication that people who rent the house, my house, for example, and it could be up to 20 people who stay in the house, that somehow or another their attendance at the house, simply because they are short-term rentals, puts them in a category